appraising or interpreting the situation and the behavior one can be motivated for. And within this, all these motivational processes is also a person's self-belief, so what they believe about their own abilities. And this is something that I will focus on in this talk. And this blue motivation unit then, depending on what happens in there, so how the situation is being interpreted, certain behaviors, learning behaviors are being activated or deactivated. And these are represented here in green. Oh, there's something. I can't. I think you need to do it on the laptop.
Yeah.
No.
Try pressing enter.
Me?
No, Michael.
No,
Not there. Try pressing enter on that. Is there a mouse?
No.
It's on your mouse. We've got Chris's white.
Okay. Oh.
We can't see on here what's up there.
No, we don't. It's not here.
Yeah, I think it's the screen is extended.
Oh,
There it is. There it is.
wow, this is collective intelligence.
Yeah.
This is like a reinforcement learning.
Yeah.
Research.
Click just on that top one.
Which way was it?
Oh,
there it is.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yay. Continuing. Okay, I was explaining the green arrow. So this is the behaviors activated by motivation. And if you talk about learning, these can reflect different quantities of learning. So effort investment, for example, or different qualities. So strategies, for example. And these green arrows are actually how motivation influences achievement. And then depending on these behaviors, whether they're adaptive or less adaptive, this positively or negatively influences achievement, which is then being perceived as success or failure experiences, and attributions are being made, and this feeds back into these self-beliefs and these motivation units and so on. So it's a cyclical process. And in this review, in this collective endeavor of this review, one of the conclusions was also that these behaviors, these mediating behaviors, are also understudied in the literature of these bidirectional influences. And in this talk, I will focus on the blue part and then the self-beliefs and how different beliefs people can have about themselves activate different kinds of learning behaviors. And no. Oh, now it's stuck again.
I think ours online also appear to be stuck, just so you know.
Just use and click on that one and then press the.
There we are, it worked.
Cool, okay. Okay, so this is basically the same, so I can go for it quickly. It's just one example cycle, and in this case, it's a failure experience of a girl. And then you see that these different processes feed into each other. So depending on this motivation unit, this failure experience is being perceived either positively as a learning opportunity or more negatively as a failure possibility. And these different interpretations lead to different behaviors, which can be adaptive or maladaptive, which then have positive or less positive influence on achievement, and so on. So these processes are self-reinforcing. And in the previous figure, I didn't explain, but there were gray arrows. So these were the external influences on the cycle, which are interesting because they also provide possibilities for intervening. which I will talk about more later. So these are the external influences, but with this example cycle, I wanted to show that there are a lot of influences also at other levels, also more internal influences. For example, the physiology and brain levels, so different physiological resilience, for example, vagal activity, and in terms of the brain, processes like error and feedback monitoring, but also how the brain is tuned to rewards, so more tuned to approaching positive rewards or avoiding negative rewards or avoiding failure experiences. And then there are also these more mind and cognitive levels, which I already mentioned a bit on the previous slide. So how children, or people in general, think about themselves. And an example of such a self-belief is mindset. And this is also related to different goals that people set for themselves in learning situations, which can also be more focused on approaching or avoiding mastery and performance. So in my lab at the Vrije Universiteit, so well pronounced by Michael, the lab of learning, we try to combine all these levels of influence on motivated learning behavior in our different projects to answer the overarching question of how children become motivated and resilient learners. So we have projects on the individual level and different levels within the individual, but also the influence of teachers, parents, and peers, and also the more societal values, dominant beliefs in society, including also myths. And then we try, if we can, to study this also during development. So I based my lab mostly on an ERC starting grant, but then in the meantime, different grants and people were added. So it got more and more possible to capture most of these levels. But for today, I will focus on the studies we did in my ERC project, which just finished. So the timing of this sabbatical is really nice in that way. And to make it a bit more concrete, I had this brief video of a girl. In terms of time, yeah, let's just play it because it's, if it works. Ah, okay. Yes. Yeah, I really like this video because it shows, well, this girl clearly persists in trying to achieve her goal. You also see some of the external influences. But then the question is, why does this girl persist? Why she keeps trying, and why do other children give up, maybe already after the first attempt? So this is at least partly related to this belief system of children, including their ability beliefs and their goal orientations, which together, but also with some more motivational constructs, is sometimes called the mindset meaning system. So it is the system of beliefs that give meaning to a certain situation. And in it's more of a continuum, but the two extremes are called incremental beliefs or growth mindset. And that means that someone believes that their abilities can be improved, that they have influence becoming better at something by taking certain actions, like trying again, investing more effort, asking help, trying different strategies. And these children often set learning goals for themselves, so they're more aimed at improving themselves. And on the other side, you have what we call entity beliefs or a fixed mindset. And those children believe that it's more or less fixed, how good they are at something, and they don't have a lot of influence. So they're more focused on proving that they have this like fixed amount of ability, or avoid showing that they don't have it. So these are more often related to performance goals. And these different meaning systems come into play, especially in a situation of failure or risk of failure. So in this movie, the very challenging task that this girl is taking on. And then this mindset meaning system influences the interpretation of this situation and also the behaviors that get activated. So the girl in the video seems to have an incremental mindset and learning goals. So if it doesn't work out, she thinks, I should try harder, change my strategy. I can learn more if I choose this challenge. But if she would have more a fixed mindset, then she might think after the first attempt, oh, it shows that I don't have this ability, I can do it. I'd better choose something easier because I don't want to look stupid. And the important thing is, coming back to this cycle, that these interpretations and behaviors then like reinforce these beliefs, because if she doesn't try again, she won't improve. So this confirms her fixed ability beliefs. I'm going to showcase a couple of studies from my lab in which we investigated the role of these beliefs, these mindsets of adolescents on their learning behaviors, because this was one of the core projects within my ESC grant. And in this first study, we studied the relation between mindset and the choice of adolescents to invest effort. And we adapted a task that was already there in the literature, the math effort task, in which young adolescents had to solve math equations. And first, we had a baseline measure, and then they had 20 rounds in which they could choose their own difficulty level at which they wanted to solve these equations. And there were 5 different levels, and the first level was really quite easy, and then the numbers became bigger and bigger. So after 3 equations, they could choose again. Do I want to stay at this level? Do I want to have more difficult equations or easier ones? And just to give you an idea, this is the first level, and they had to sum up these numbers and type in the answer. And this was the most difficult level. And then they played this task. They made these, first we assessed their baseline arithmetic ability, and then they had these 20 choice rounds. I'm going to show a simplified version of the results. So we did optimize mindset here only for the graph, but we analyzed it with linear mixed models, also including gender and the amount of mistakes they made in the previous round. But I won't go into the 3-way interactions, but show the main result here, which is that mindset did influence the choices that these adolescents made. So they all had comparable baseline levels, and then they all the first choice was to go below that level. But then if you look at the time course of the choices, on average, children with a more growth mindset then went to choose above their baseline levels.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How did that relate to accuracy on the maths? Were the kids with growth mindset just better at maths?
Well, that's what we tried to catch with this baseline measure. And there was no difference in the baseline measure. So there they performed these equations without free choice, so at each level, and then we took the average of that.
And did you look at that, how that relates to their subsequent choices, how accuracy relates to it?
Yeah, so we controlled for this baseline in the model, yeah. And also, which I'm not showing here, but we included the number of mistakes they made in the round before making the next choice. And that also did have an influence on their choices. But there was also then an interaction with gender, and it becomes a bit more complicated. But it's all in there, yeah. And we also looked at these data with a different type of analysis, a person-centered analysis, to look for strategy profiles. So we call them effort profiles. And there we did a latent profile analysis with as indicated variables whether students chose on average more below their baseline, at their baseline, or above their baseline, and also how variable their choices were. So that's the standard deviation here. Well, the SDC, I lost my mouse. Oh, there it is, this one. And it looks a bit complicated with all the lines in there, but I'll try to walk you through them. So we found the optimal solution with 5 different profiles. And the first profile with the blue line, we call them the avoiders because they mostly chose below their baseline. So they played like on the safe side. They wanted easier equations and they were actually able to solve. And then the next profile I want to show you is the black one. Because these students mostly chose above their baseline. So we call these the challengers. And then the green dotted line we called explorers because they were rather high at the standard deviation. So they seem to really explore between difficulty levels, but in general below their baseline, more than above their baseline. And then another group that also seemed to be exploring a lot chose more above their baseline. So we call these the exploring challengers. So they were a bit in between the explorers and the challengers. And then there was a group that were really like very steady at their baseline. So they were happy where they were with what they were good at. So there really seem to be different strategies in whether or not adolescents wanted to invest effort in going for challenging equations. And we looked how these different profiles differed in their score on the mindset questionnaire. And there we found, I hope it's visible, that the exploring challengers and the challengers, so the 2 profiles that chose above their baseline, were also the students with the highest score on the growth mindset questionnaire compared to the avoiders specifically, and also the exploring challengers compared to the steady. So we think this is nice because it's really a more data-driven way to show that mindset relates to different types of learning behaviors. The next study I wanted to show is really work in progress. So very preliminary, and we are still like a bit puzzled by the results also. So this is an fMRI study in which we wanted to study effort and reward anticipation in adolescents. And very briefly, some background, we know that adolescents are more sensitive to rewards, but it's not so often studied in the context of academic rewards. It's more in social and monetary rewards. So we wanted to focus a bit more on the school context. And another known thing is that the value of a potential reward is related to the amount of effort that is needed to gain this reward. It's called the net value. And in general, if it takes more effort to gain a reward, it's lower values. But at the same time, there's also evidence showing that effort in itself can be rewarding. So it might be that there are individual differences in how these net values are estimated. So we thought, could it be that it's related to how a person thinks about themselves, this self-beliefs that I talked about, mindset? Because we know from the literature and our own studies that adolescents with a growth mindset might find upcoming effortful tasks more rewarding because it leads to learning and mastery. So the main question we want to ask with this study is whether we would see differences in effort and reward anticipation in adolescents with different mindsets. And these effort profiles that I showed before, because we studied this in a subsample of the same adolescents that performed this math effort task with the 3 choices. So in this subsample, we invited them to the fMRI scanner and we used a different math task, which was more focused on anticipating an upcoming equation. So we focused this task on the cube. And so they would see a cue whether they would get an easy equation for 1 point, an easy equation for 10 points, a difficult or hard equation for 1 point, and or a hard equation for 10 points. So it was a 2x2 design of effort and reward. And then we analyzed the fMRI activity really around this event of the cue. So really during anticipation of doing the equation. Yeah, as I already mentioned, in the same participants, we also have this math effort task. So in this fMRI task, the equations were pre-programmed, so they were either difficult or easy, so they couldn't choose. But we also, from this behavioral task, we knew what they would choose if they would have the free choice. So we analyzed the fMRI data around the cue. So we did a 2x2 analysis on the whole brain basis. And as I mentioned, these results are quite preliminary, but we found some main effects of effort. And I see some of it is a little bit hidden, but maybe I shouldn't attempt to do something about that. But in the top panel, you see some regions where we found a main effect of effort. So a higher fMRI activity for the cue signaling, there's a hard equation coming up versus easy. And these were areas that were mostly in cognitive control regions like dorsal ACC, pre-SMA. We also found some regions that showed a main effect of reward. So a higher activation for any equation that would be rewarded with 10 points for answering correctly versus 1 point. And we also found one motor area that showed interaction between effort and reward. And it seemed to be related a bit to whether the amount of the reward and the effort needed for the equation was conflicting or not. So there was highest activity if it wasn't conflicting. So the difficult equation for the highest reward or the easy equation for the lowest reward. But actually we were most interested in seeing whether this anticipatory activity, because we assume that's when they estimate this net value, like is it worth the effort to go for this reward? That would be different depending on the mindset of these adolescents. So we also looked at whole brain correlations between a specific contrast. So we chose the contrast of the hard equation for 1 point versus the hard equation for 10 points, because we figured that for adolescents with a growth mindset, they would want to invest the effort anyway, independent of the reward. And for a fixed mindset, they would only want to do that for the higher reward. But the correlation with mindset didn't give anything at all. And we also did the same correlation analysis, but then not with the mindset questionnaire scores, but with the effort choice on this behavioral task with the free choice of difficulty level. Because with this profile analysis, we show that it's like a behavioral correlates of mindset assessed in a different way. And there we did find some regions that show the correlation, but we're not completely sure yet what it means. Oh, sorry, you're not seeing it. So for example, in this left angular gyrus area, we found that, so what we took here as the behavioral measure is their average choice in this math effort task compared to their baseline. So if it's positive, they chose on average above their baseline. If it's negative, they chose below their baseline with this free choice task. And then going up, it means they showed more activity for the hard equations for the low reward compared to the high reward. And in this quadrant is kind of what we expected. So if they were not going for challenging choices, but for the safer choices, so below their baseline, we figured that they would only want to invest the effort for more reward. But why it really also goes in this direction, we are not completely sure why there is such a clear difference in this quadrant with higher activity for the hard equations with low reward. So this is all still in progress. So any ideas are welcome.
Can I ask, so you did hard 1 versus hard 10 contrast, but you didn't try to subtract the easy one? Because you might be too specific about the growth mindset would be the difference between hard and...
Yeah, we really...
trying for the easy activity might help.
Yeah, we thought a lot about what contrast to take, and we were a bit limited by what was possible, and we used Brain Voyager here. So we couldn't actually use like this main effect of effort in a whole brain correlation with a behavioral correlate, but we had to choose a specific contrast, and we had these four Q conditions. So we figured it would be most informative to look at the difficult equations with the different rewards. But you're right that we could make it a more complex contrast with subtraction also. That might be a nice idea. Yeah. Okay, I think I'll continue because I have a couple more studies lined up. In one of them, I wanted to nuance the idea of mindsets a little bit. So you might be aware that there's quite some discussion going on about this whole concept, whether it's really something robust or meaningful, because there are also a lot of null findings in studies that try to look at the relation between the growth mindset and achievements and interventions stimulating a growth mindset. And the picture that really emerges also from the studies in this project is that one of the reasons why the relation between the growth mindset and achievement is not always found is that, well, it's more complex, which is probably not a surprise. So there are some studies that look at not like simplistic linear relations between this mindset measured by a questionnaire and achievements, but that look at combinations of different motivational variables and how that relates to achievements. But also in the studies I already showed, it might be more interesting to look at these learning behaviors that mediate because there are so many other factors that influence achievements. But here in this study, I wanted to show you that we also analyzed our data, our questionnaire data, with looking at latent profiles. And there we also find a more complex picture than just a typical fixed mindset and typical growth mindset profile. So this is also a bit simplified. We had more motivational constructs in this analysis. So for the goals, we also had the avoidance and approach dimensions, but I simplified it a bit to make the differences clearer. So in this latent profile analysis, we found an optimal solution with 4 profiles. And these are all relative scores. So this is what we called the more or less typical fixed mindset profile with relatively lowest growth mindset scores, lowest positive effort beliefs, relatively lowest learning goals, and relatively high performance goals. But then we found 3 different growth mindset profiles that especially differed in the strength of their performance goals. So typically the literature shows that growth mindset is related to learning goals or mastery goals. But we found actually that these 3 different profiles either had the low performance goals, so this would be kind of a typical growth mindset profile, but there were also a lot of students that had much higher performance goals or even the highest. And the interesting thing about this study, I think, is when we compared different outcome measures for these 4 profiles, because then we see that if we look at achievement, so at grades, that 2 of the growth mindset profiles actually did better than the fixed mindset profile, but also then the growth mindset profile with the highest performance goals. And we also had another outcome measure in which we tried to capture some academic well-being. So we used the school burnout inventory. So it's kind of the opposite from well-being. And there we found that only this growth mindset profile with the low performance goals was showing the lowest school burnout symptoms, or the children in this profile. So this nuances the idea and shows that it's not always advantageous to have a growth mindset, but that it's really the combination with other motivational variables that influences the outcomes in terms of achievement or stress, academic stress or resilience. Then I will continue. I don't know how much time I should leave for questions, but it's just, okay, I'll just go on. Coming back to the cycle that I started with, but then visualizing it as a continuous process to show that these self-reinforcing influences can across development lead to more adaptive and maladaptive patterns of more approach-related behaviors, developing resilience and more avoidance patterns in which their children become more vulnerable to setbacks. And as I showed also when I showed it as a cycle with these gray arrows, that motivation interventions have been studied to try to divert these cycles, and especially to divert a more maladaptive pattern to a more upwards cycle. And one type of interventions that has been investigated quite a lot are mindset interventions. They basically usually are based on the idea that if you teach children that their brains are plastic, are changeable, malleable, that's the basis that abilities are also malleable. And this is actually what got me interested in mindset research, because I think it's a very nice opportunity for how neuroscience information can be relevant in education. So that's like the core of many of these mindset interventions, that they teach children about brain plasticity and then also relate that to different mindsets. But as I already mentioned, there's also a lot of discussion about the reliability or robustness of this relation between mindset and achievement, but also about interventions that claim to really improve achievements by promoting this growth mindset. So it's still really in debate whether this is something that we should pursue or not. Although this, for example, this meta-analysis generally found small to absent effects, but there seem to be some subgroups for which there are stronger gains to be reached with stimulating growth mindsets. But anyway, at the start of this ESC grant, this discussion was a little bit less vivid. The idea that we had was that instead of just teaching, like theoretically, to children, okay, the brain is plastic, your brain is plastic, so the growth mindset is actually the most plausible way that it works. We thought, what if we don't just teach them this, but we have them really experience that they have influence on their own brain. We based this on neurofeedback using mobile EEG. So this is how it started. So we thought that if we use mobile EEG to measure brain activity and then have some brain-computer interface feeding back with a nice interface to really show them that if they learn something or if they influence their, for example, their focus, that they really in real time see that this also changes their brain activity. So that's what we started to develop. This became an intervention called Explore Your Brain, ontdek je brein. And the aims were to increase the efficacy of a growth mindset intervention, because we thought that with an experiential elements, it would be more like internalized and would be more effective. So we combined the typical psychosocial elements, so also the more theoretical information, to a psychophysiological component, which was the neurofeedback-based experience of influence. And we took a lot of time to develop this intervention because we really wanted to do it together with adolescents to really create an experience that would really work for them. And also because we were going to use this new technology with mobile EEG, we wanted to explore if there could also be any like more negative impacts that we as researchers didn't anticipate. And we did this with the Responsible Research and Innovation Framework, which we really did at the beginning, so we could really be responsive to what these interviews with adolescents and parents and teachers demonstrated. And we also went out of the box with all these different ideas of how we could create a very powerful experience of influence for adolescents. So we did this with a team of artists and programmers. And I show this picture because that was one idea that worked quite well. So this girl is wearing an EEG, very simple EEG device. And the instruction was to increase her focus. And then if that worked, so we used theta-beta ratio for that, then the stronger her focus, the more these tentacles would move towards her. And we found that from everything we tried, that really created the strongest experience of influence. Like she really felt like she was really moving something with her brain. So this is one thing we took from these multiple user tests, and we translated it into a digital game based on Guitar Hero, actually. So here, these neurons are also moving. And then the instruction is there, I'm going to play it in a while. There is a white ring, and then the instruction was to try to pull that ring towards her, and that would connect neurons. So this is how it looks. So she's doing, this is this white ring that she's pulling towards her. So she's doing that with their focus, basically. And then that was very rewarding. So that was one of the 3 games that we developed. Another one was a bit more simple, where the instruction was to move this line up. And a third one was based on auditory feedback, actually, but that didn't work so well for most of the students. So they had to read a text, and if they were more focused during reading, then the noises they were hearing of 3D classroom recording would become lower in volume. But that turned out to be quite confusing. So these 3 neurofeedback games, that was one of the lessons in the intervention that we developed. So it's the 3rd lesson, actually. So we had an RCT in which we had a growth mindset intervention with 4 lessons and a control intervention with 4 lessons. And they were matched on length and global contents, not global, that's Dutch, general content. And then in the 3rd lesson, this the growth mindset group had these neurofeedback games to generate this experience. And the control group also played around a bit with this EEG to match for the coolness of the mobile EEG devices. And then the results, we recently published them end of last year. So these are the results of the pre-intervention measure, so that's T0, and the 1-year follow-up. And then the experimental intervention is the solid line. So we found that after a year, they scored higher on growth mindset questionnaire. And we didn't see differences in the 2 conditions in the school burnout inventory. So actually for both groups, this went up. unfortunately. But we did find relatively, compared to other interventions, big effects on grades. Here it looks very small, but it turned out that it was mostly driven by a protective effect against a decline in math grades. And we also have another very recent T3 follow-up and analysis. So between T2 and T3, COVID happened. So a very natural intervention, but not with a really good control group, of course. So what we did was that we adapted our T3 measure. So that's a year after this 1 year follow-up, to include questionnaires about their perceived stress exposure by COVID and coping styles. I didn't have time. Oh, sorry, but I'll come back to this one later. I didn't have time to put it into details, but it's just came out last week. Very generally, what we found was that the growth mindset group, but also if we analyze it in the total group, the growth mindset at T2 was predictive of being more resilient against COVID experienced stress. So they maintained more well-being, again measured with this school burnout inventory, despite being exposed to COVID stress. And that was mediated by more adaptive coping styles. So that's a very new result. So very briefly, because I forgot this one, this is what our the third lesson in the intervention looked like. So a whole classroom hooked up with these mobile EEG devices, going through these neurofeedback games. And just to mention that we also working on analyzing this specific neurofeedback lesson, only this third lesson. So what I showed before was the analysis of the entire RCT, but we're also looking at what happens when they experience this influence. So for example, we ask them their subjective feeling of influence after doing these neurofeedback games. And that's turned out to be quite strongly related to different motivational constructs, for example, but it was also quite strongly correlated to the objective influence, which we could measure with this EEG theta beta ratio, so how well they really managed to influence their brain activity. But that's also still work in progress. So that's basically it. So to wrap up, I talked about the bi-directional interaction between motivation and achievement, and that this is mediated by learning behaviors, these green arrows. And I focused on examples of mindset or self-beliefs, ability beliefs within this motivation unit, activating different types of effortful choices, but also that the story is much more complex than a growth mindset always leads to better results. And I've also shown that there are influences at a lot of different levels on all these elements in this cycle. So it's important to consider development as really something dynamically interactive across all these levels. And lastly, I showed that these cyclic developmental patterns might be diverted by interventions such as the one we developed. Yeah, so I want to thank my lab, the Lab of Learning, and there's also a lot of other projects that we have running that I wasn't able to include. So just to show it here in case you're interested, and because I'm around for a while, we could talk about any of these projects as well at some other point. So thank you very much.
So let's do some questions in the room here, and then maybe some guys online. If you want to hand over to you, you can sort of turn on your microphones and ask questions from Zoom. All right, questions in the room.
That was a really, really great talk. Thank you so much. And I was really happy to hear you talk about the growth mindset as not being the and be all and end all to learning and motivation, because I struggle with the literature a lot. And one of the things I wanted to ask is sort of to even push you a little further with that, because one of my issues with what I think of the problem with the mindset stuff is this kind of way, it's like if you mindset, then you're adaptive, and if you don't have growth mindset, then it's maladaptive. And I think there's many cases and many situations in which it might be actually quite adaptive to give up and quite adaptive to say, actually, I mean, I loved watching that little girl jump, and that was fantastic. But there comes a point where you have to walk away. And you have to be able to say that this is not going to happen. And also it's just teaching children that your brain is plastic. Teaching children that means you can then do anything you want to do, learn anything. It's just not true. Yeah. Right? No. I mean, you could teach me the rest of my life to sing, and I'm still gonna sound like a strangled chicken. Like it's just not gonna happen. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about those points.
Yeah, those are very important points. And actually, this is one of the things we talked about in this responsible research and innovation approach that we took. So in these interviews with students, parents, and teachers, we really wanted to know whether they had realistic ideas about brain plasticity and whether or they thought that everyone could become like a genius as long as they work hard enough. Well, in our with participants, that they seem to have realistic ideas, but it was something that we really wanted to consider also to include in the intervention to avoid giving the idea that there are no limits or that it's really all about effort, because you're right, it's just not true. And it's actually, I think I might have something. Yeah, I'm also very interested in this more societal side of the whole message of plasticity and growth mindset. So I prepared for your question.
I'm not gonna lie, that's a great answer slide. It's pretty good.
You've got slides for all the answers.
Yeah, I'm curious, yeah. No, but I think that this is a very important discussion, how much we should pursue this message. It's very important to have it nuanced and also have a dialogue with what we want society to focus on. And yeah.
Thank you. That's great.
To me. So yeah, thank you. I just as a teacher, I just wanted to ask you about, I suppose, as a teacher, so growth mindset, put posters up, try and use it. I think a lot of teachers sort of fed up a bit. I suppose for me, I'm trying to create a culture, and I also teach them about their brain neuroplasticity is important. I wondered what you would say about creating the right culture in the classroom for nurturing growth mindset in a positive way that it's not, that encourages them to make mistakes and things. But are there any other strategies that as a teacher we can do it in a sort of sustainable way that empowers them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think there are no simple answers yet. I know that more and more research is also focusing on this more context level of growth mindset, because if it's really only focused on the individual, that has to match the environment, right? So for example, in these profiles that we saw, we also think that this shows that with a growth mindset, and you can still be very much oriented on performance. And yeah, why that is the case, it could also be because children are adapting to a very much performance-focused school climate. So I think there should be a much better match than between this context and the focus in schools and in society in general. But then these are becoming really big questions, of course. And yeah, I know there are some groups that really look at different contextual factors, like feedback from a teacher, but you might be familiar with that work, whether that's more focused on process or on person. But I think there are also a bit mixed results with that. But also the classroom climate, and I think also the teacher as an example. Yeah, I don't know. That's...
I've got a million questions, but I'll limit myself to two. Just one is a kind of technical question about the EEG thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you're wrapping this strap around, where are you recording? Where is there multiple?
Yeah.
One, just
for our specific use of this mobile EEG, oh, it's not really showing actually.
No, the pictures.
Yeah, it didn't really matter. So we used the theta beta paradigm, and then it doesn't matter so much. The location is not very relevant. It's
so
really
moving the thing on the screen. Use the ratio of frequencies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then we know that if that's higher than or lower, then that's more related to higher or lower focus. Yeah.
The reason I was asking that is I've seen similar things where they're not doing that. But what I think they're picking up on is basically
muscle. Yeah.
Because you're trying to concentrate, clench your thing and check the brow.
Yeah.
And for your story to the kids, it doesn't make any difference.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's probably part of our effect as well, to be honest. But we also reasoned that it doesn't matter because it's still they still have this online experience of their efforts resulting in something. Yeah.
The other question I was going to ask is just in back to the study where you had the interaction between effort and reward.
Oh yeah, the fMRI study.
Whether it was the fMRI, I'm just wondering whether you thought about why a bit more about why certain people will be choosing the hard effort, high reward rather than the low effort, high reward, so not purely reward driven. And I wondered whether in that context there might be some kind of social pressure, because some of the kids I work with in primary school, whatever, it's cool to do the hard questions, not cool to do the easy questions. Yeah. So is there a social dimension to choosing those other than some other bizarre?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So so here they actually couldn't choose. So maybe your question is more related to the
that's right.
The effort test.
That's right. It was that one.
This one, yeah. I think yes, definitely there's probably social aspects which we didn't capture here. We do have I have a PhD student who is actually looking at social networks and similarity within friend networks in mindsets, for example. And there's also some literature showing indeed that different networks, different classrooms, they have different things that are cool to be smart or not. And I think that could be really of influence. Yeah, but that's still being studied. Yeah.
So
I have to leave as well, but it's not.
So I'm going to jump in before we go to the Zoom and ask a question, and it's really a plea for help because I'm really struggling to put together some ideas in my head from what you talked about. I mean, I don't want to disparage growth mindset stuff. We know now from the meta-analyses that it's patchy. Works better for low achieving kids and this kind of thing. But I generally thought of it as it's more like an aspirational fridge magnet, right? Growth mindset. Try hard, go, yo, you can succeed, that kind of thing. But then, you're kind of now also presenting it as a sort of semi-malleable trait where individuals differ somehow in the profile. Mm-hmm. But then on your first slide, it fell in a kind of cognitive mechanism box. And that's why I really start to struggle to think about mindset as a mechanism. And the reason for that is twofold. Right at the beginning, it was in your cognitive, mind, cognition level, self-belief. Trying to think of it as a mechanism. And the reason is, if you get into neuroeconomics, where they spend a lot of time putting people in scanners, trying to see what parts of the brain light up when they make decisions, it turns out beliefs don't massively influence behavior, right? It's it's emotions and reward history. And yet here you're pushing mindset as being, it's all about what you believe you can do. And then when you get into the brain mechanisms, I mean, I generally thought of mental effort as a learning mechanism where you're updating reward estimate errors and calibrating those against amygdala threat stuff, but also curiosity, and it's this dynamic calibration. I'm estimating this problem should take this amount of effort with this risk of failure. I'll give it a go. Now I update my estimates. What is my new estimate of how likely I am to succeed? What is the cost of failure? It's a calibration system. But to present mindset as if it were a mechanism just seems really monolithic.
Yeah, I didn't mean to present it as a mechanism, but first what you just said about this calibration, reward and effort, that I totally agree with that, but I think there are also individual differences, right? In the details of it. Yeah. Sure. And there is something that beliefs could come into play. Among other factors, it's never, of course,
so would you think then that beliefs are more effective in manipulating application of mental effort than reward histories are?
I don't know. I mean, we also, I didn't focus so much here on the null results. We have also studies in which, for example, we have included mindset as a more like between subject variable, but also during this math effort task, the mistakes, but also physiology, the pre-ejection period we use there. And there we don't find any interactions or effects of mindset. And so I think it's really depending on what you put into your study, into your model, and it's complicated. Yeah, but I think coming back to the mechanism, I don't think mindset is actually a mechanism, but that there are mechanisms by which beliefs can have influence on behavior, which we try to study in different ways.
I imagine the mindset being like a mediating mechanism in terms of whether an intervention has a particular outcome and individual differences in outcomes resulting in an intervention. You can imagine the mindset being a mediator. But then the question is, how do you then disentangle the different components of mindset? Like what exactly is mindset and how, I mean, we've had a very old debate about what exactly feeds into it. How is it related to things like self-esteem and grit? Yeah. And perseverance. Yeah.
Academic self-concept. Yeah, it's a lot of these related. But it's the problem if you study motivation. There's so many theories.
But the other end of the spectrum is that it's just pure confabulation. That people's resilience is driven by their emotional limbic system calibration and reward history. So people coming into these experiments where you're rating them as growth mindset or fixed mindset, you have no knowledge of their previous reinforcement learning history about whether their efforts have been rewarded in the past. So they may already have adapted to what I do doesn't matter because of their reward histories, right?
Yeah, and because of their personality traits, for example, there's really a lot involved. So that's what we did try to put together here in this blue unit, right? Because we definitely think emotions are very important, but it is like also influenced by these expectancies and values, which depend on your self-concept, self-beliefs. So it's all in there.
So should we go to Zoom? I don't know whether there's anyone still on Zoom, but if they have any questions, or you guys want to read out anything from the chat bar, you go ahead.
I'll read a couple. There's a couple in the chat. So Uliana asks if you could just go back to the slide with the procedure of the fMRI study. The effort and reward anticipation one. Yeah, that one. I think that's the correct one. Yeah. If it's not, let me know. And somebody asked, so this was actually quite early in the presentation, people asked, how did you define, so in that very first study, how did you define which students had a growth mindset and which had a fixed mindset?
Yeah, so basically with the questionnaire that most people use, that is not great, to be honest, but it's what people use. So it's a self-report questionnaire, which gives a continuous score ranging from more fixed to more growth. Does that answer the question?
I think so. If it doesn't, anybody speak up. So we've got one more question from Janie that's just come in. She asks, do you have any thoughts as to why maths outcomes were particularly impacted by the intervention?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, we gave that a lot of thought. So we didn't specifically focus the intervention on math, but there were, I think, most of the examples that we gave, or a lot of them were in some way related to math. And also more generally, it's a topic that is, of course, experienced as quite challenging by a lot of students. And also where there are strong beliefs about that being good in math is because you simply are good at it or not. So that we think that the ideas, general beliefs about math ability are a bit more fixed than maybe to some other subjects.
Really interesting, thank you. Don't know if there's any other questions.
Super. If not, well, let's wrap up and thank our speaker again for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you all for listening.
Super. All right. Thanks, everyone on Zoom.
Bye.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Bye.
Should I do something? Or?
Yeah.